Some disappearances happen in dark alleys. Others happen in the middle of wars. But a few happen in full public view, in official meetings, surrounded by witnesses, documentation, and international attention. And somehow, those are the ones that become the most impossible to explain. In August of 1978, one of the most powerful and respected religious leaders in the Arab world boarded a plane to Libya after receiving an official invitation from Muammar Gaddafi himself. His name was Imam Musa al-Sadr, a man known not only for his religious influence, but for his political intelligence, his ability to unite divided communities, and his growing influence across Lebanon and the wider Middle East. He was not a man who could simply vanish. And if you are interested in real cases like this, stories that remain unresolved decades later and still raise uncomfortable questions about power and truth, consider subscribing to the channel, because these are exactly the kinds of mysteries we explore in depth. He was traveling with two trusted companions, Sheikh Mohammed Yaqub and journalist Abbas Badreddin. The visit was supposed to be routine, a diplomatic discussion that would last only a few days before their scheduled return to Lebanon, but they never came back, according to Libyan authorities at the time. The three men finished their meetings and left the country on August 31st, boarding a flight to Rome, at least. That was the official story. But almost immediately, inconsistencies began to appear. Italian immigration records showed no trace of their arrival. No airport cameras captured them. No airline could confirm their boarding. No hotel in Rome had their names. It was as if three internationally known figures had simply evaporated between one country and another. The explanation quickly began to fall apart. Investigators discovered that their luggage had actually remained in their Tripoli hotel. Even more disturbing, witnesses claimed they were last seen entering a meeting with Gaddafi's inner circle shortly before their supposed departure. This changed everything. Instead of a mysterious disappearance, the case began to look like something far more dangerous, a political vanishing. In the years that followed, multiple theories emerged. Some believed al-Sadr had been assassinated after political disagreements with Gaddafi. Others claimed he had been secretly imprisoned. Some defectors from Libyan intelligence later suggested he may have been executed shortly after the meeting. But no body was ever found. No official confession was ever made. No physical evidence ever confirmed any theory. And that uncertainty became the most disturbing part of the story. Because without a body, there was no closure. Without confirmation, there was no justice. Without answers, the case never truly ended. For decades, Musa al-Sadr's disappearance became one of the Middle East's most sensitive unsolved mysteries. Lebanese governments repeatedly demanded answers. Investigations reopened again and again. After Gaddafi's regime fell in 2011, many believed the truth would finally surface. It never did. Even after the collapse of the Libyan government, the chaos that followed only buried the truth deeper. Former intelligence officers disappeared, documents were destroyed, and potential witnesses died before they could testify. Every revolution seemed to erase more evidence instead of revealing it. What makes this case especially disturbing is not just that a man disappeared, but that he disappeared at the highest level of power. In a situation where answers should have existed, where records should have been kept, where accountability should have been unavoidable, and yet nothing. Today, more than for decades later, Imam Musa al-Sadr remains officially missing. Not confirmed dead, not confirmed alive, just missing. For his followers, this is not just a cold case. It is an open wound that never healed. Many still believe he could have been secretly held for years. Others believe the truth is known by people who will never speak. And perhaps the most chilling possibility is this, that the perfect disappearance is not the one where nobody sees what happened. But the one where everyone knows something happened, yet no one can ever prove what it was. Because the story of Musa, al-Sadr, was not just about a man who disappeared. It was about how power can make a person vanish without leaving a crime scene, without leaving evidence, and without leaving anyone who is able to speak freely about what really happened, and disturbingly. His case would not be the last time something like this would happen in the Arab world. If Musa, al-Sadr's disappearance showed how power can erase a person, the next case shows something perhaps even more unsettling. How someone can disappear, even while the entire world is watching. Razan Zeitouneh was not just another activist in Syria. She was one of the most recognized human rights lawyers in the country. Known for documenting government abuses long before the Syrian civil war began. For years, she had defended political prisoners and exposed human rights violations, fully aware that her work made her a target. When the Syrian uprising began in 2011, she did not flee the country like many others did. She stayed. Instead, she went into hiding and continued documenting kidnappings, torture cases, and disappearances through a network of activists. Her reports became some of the most trusted sources of information about what was happening inside Syria. But by 2013, the danger had changed. It was no longer just government forces people feared. Rebel factions, extremist groups, and criminal militias had begun operating in opposition-controlled territories, creating an environment where even those fighting for freedom were no longer safe. Razan knew the risks. She had already survived assassination attempts. She had already received threats. But she continued working. On the night of December 9, 2013, Razan was inside her office in the city of Douma, on opposition maskers. With her were 3 colleagues, her husband Wal Hamada, activist Samira Al-Khalil, and lawyer Nazim Hamadi. They would later become known as the Douma Four. Sometime during the night, unknown armed men entered the building. There were no reports of gunfire, no signs of struggle large enough to alert nearby residents. By morning, all had vanished. Their computers were gone. Their documents were missing. Their office had been carefully emptied of sensitive material. It looked less like a chaotic kidnapping and more like a targeted extraction. Almost immediately, suspicions fell on a powerful Islamist faction controlling the area, at the time Jaish al-Islam. Activists accused the group of silencing critics inside opposition territory. The group denied involvement. No arrests were ever made. No rescue attempts ever succeeded. No credible claim of responsibility ever emerged. And this is where the case becomes deeply disturbing. Unlike many disappearances in war zones, this one did not lack documentation. Razan was internationally known. Human rights organizations demanded answers. Foreign governments raised the case publicly. There was pressure, there was attention, there were investigations, and still, nothing. Years passed. Former detainees released from secret prisons were interviewed. Defectors were questioned. Captured militants were interrogated. None could definitively say what happened to them. Some claimed they were executed shortly after being taken. Others believed they were secretly transferred between detention sites. Some insisted they might still be alive in undisclosed prisons, but no proof ever surfaced. What makes this case especially haunting is the cruel irony at its center. Razan Zeitouneh had spent years documenting the disappearances of others, carefully recording names, dates, and testimonies so they would not be forgotten. Then she became one of them. A person documented only through the memories of those who last saw her, a file that never closes, a story without an ending. Even today, her name continues to appear in human rights reports not as a lawyer or activist, but as one of the disappeared she once tried to defend. And perhaps one of the most chilling aspects of this case is how it demonstrates a brutal reality of modern conflicts. Sometimes the most dangerous position is not being a soldier. Sometimes it is simply being someone who writes things down. Because in environments built on fear and control, documentation itself can become a threat. And those who threaten silence often disappear first. Among the 4 activists taken that night in Douma, Samira Al-Khalil's story stands out as one of the most psychologically disturbing. Not because of how she disappeared, but because of everything she had already survived before she vanished. Samira was not new to suffering. Decades before the Syrian civil war, she had already experienced what it meant to disappear inside the Syrian prison system. In the late 1980s, she was arrested for her political activism and spent nearly 4 years in detention under the Assad regime. Those years changed her life permanently. Like many former political prisoners, she rarely spoke publicly about what she experienced. But those who knew her described someone shaped by trauma, yet unwilling to become silent. Instead of withdrawing from political life after her release, she chose a different path. She became someone who helped others survive what she had endured. When the Syrian uprising began, Samira became involved in humanitarian efforts, helping families displaced by violence and supporting detainees' relatives searching for missing loved ones. She was known not as someone seeking attention, but as someone doing quiet, difficult work behind the scenes. Friends described her as cautious, thoughtful, and deeply aware of how dangerous Syria had become. Which makes what happened next even more chilling. On the night she disappeared with Razan and the others, there was something uniquely tragic about her situation. Samira had already survived imprisonment once. She had already endured interrogation, isolation, and the psychological weight of being erased from society, and then it happened again. Except this time, there was no prison record, no charges, no official acknowledgement, no proof she was even alive after that night. For her family, this created a uniquely cruel reality. When someone is confirmed dead, grief has a shape. When someone is confirmed imprisoned, hope has direction. But when someone simply disappears, families exist in a permanent state of uncertainty. Should they mourn? Should they hope? Should they wait? Samira's husband, writer Yasin al-Hajj, would later describe this type of loss as a special kind of psychological torture. Not just for the disappeared, but for everyone connected to them. A disappearance does not end a life cleanly. It suspends it years, turned into nearly a decade. Photos of Samira began to change in a different way. Not because she aged, but because the photos themselves became older. Each year that passed made the last image of her feel more distant from the present. Frozen in time while the world moved forward without her. Some former detainees claimed they heard rumors she had been transferred between secret facilities. Others believed she may have been killed early after the abduction. None of these claims could be verified. Her name remains on missing persons lists to this day. And maybe one of the most disturbing elements of Samira's story is not just her disappearance, but what it represents. She survived prison once. She survived a regime that tried to silence her once. She survived long enough to try to help others survive. And then she entered a second disappearance. One even more complete than the first. Because at least the first time, someone admitted she existed. This time, it is as if she was removed from the official record of reality itself. Her story represents something deeply uncomfortable about unresolved disappearances. Sometimes survival does not mean safety. Sometimes surviving one nightmare only places someone on the path toward another. And in the most disturbing cases, the people who understand danger the most clearly are still not able to escape it. When people think about disappearances, they often imagine crime scenes, kidnappings, or dangerous political environments. But one of the most unsettling cases in the Arab world suggests something even more disturbing. What if someone could disappear without ever leaving their own home? The case of the missing Saudi princesses is different from the others. Not because it lacks mystery, but because of where it allegedly happened, inside one of the most powerful royal families in the world. The story centers around four daughters of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia: Saha, Jawaha, Maha, and Hala, according to reports that surfaced internationally around 2014. Two of the sisters, Sahar and Jawahar, were allegedly being held under a form of house arrest for more than a decade, not by criminals, not by militants, but allegedly under orders from within their own royal environment. The claims became public after their mother, Princess Al-Anud Al-Fayez, gave interviews stating her daughters were being isolated, restricted from communication, and denied normal freedom of movement. According to her, their situation began after they criticized certain aspects of Saudi society and internal royal dynamics. Saudi officials denied the allegations. Government representatives insisted the women were safe and living private lives by choice. But outside observers began to notice something unusual. There were no recent public appearances, no independent confirmations, no unrestricted communication. Occasionally, limited contact was reported through carefully controlled channels, including messages allegedly sent from the princesses describing restricted living conditions and lack of medical care. However, verifying these communications proved extremely difficult, and that uncertainty became the center of the mystery. Because unlike other disappearances, this was not a case where someone vanished from the streets. This was a case where someone may have vanished behind privilege, wealth, and power structures so strong that outside verification became almost impossible. Human rights organizations called for welfare checks. International media asked for proof of their well-being. But very little independently verified information ever emerged. Over time, updates became rare. Then they almost completely stopped. Which raises one of the most uncomfortable questions in disappearance cases, when information is tightly controlled. How can anyone outside truly know the difference between privacy and isolation, between protection and confinement, between silence and disappearance? What makes this case especially disturbing is how different it is from a traditional missing person case, yet how similar it feels emotionally. Because, at its core, disappearance is not always about location. Sometimes it is about access to communication, access to movement, access to proof someone is truly free. And when those things cannot be verified, the line between missing and hidden can become dangerously thin. When we look back at all four cases in this video, a pattern quietly begins to emerge. Imam Musa, al-Sadr, disappeared after entering a meeting with political power. Razan Zeitouneh disappeared after documenting abuses of power. Samira Al-Khalil disappeared after surviving power once before. And the Saudi princesses allegedly disappeared within the boundaries of power itself. Different countries, different decades, different circumstances, but a strangely similar gravity at the center of each case: power, not necessarily violence. Not necessarily chaos, but control. Because these stories suggest something deeply unsettling, that the most effective disappearances are not always the ones carried out in secret. Sometimes they happen in systems where asking questions becomes difficult, where answers become dangerous, and where time itself slowly replaces evidence. And maybe that is what makes these cases so disturbing, not just that these people disappeared, but that in each case, the systems around them were strong enough to survive the mystery, while the individuals at the center of it did not. Today, some families are still waiting. Some names are still on missing lists. Some answers may already exist somewhere, locked inside archives, memories, or conversations that may never become public. And history shows something very clear about disappearances like these. Time does not always reveal the truth. Sometimes, time only makes silence permanent. And maybe the most disturbing reality behind missing person cases is not the moment someone disappears, but the possibility that in some cases, the world simply learns to continue without ever knowing what really happened.